Welcome back. I'm joined now by Kate McBrien, the state archivist for the Maine State Archives. And, Kate, we're talking today about Maine's role really in the revolution, the independence movement that started on today, July 4th. So, talk to me a little bit about that. How did Maine play into the revolution?
Well, at the time period of the American Revolution, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts. But we actually had, as Massachusetts became more and more engaged in the fight towards independence, starting with the battles of Lexington and Concord that took place in Massachusetts in April 1775, Maine people, those living in the province of Maine, part of Massachusetts at the time, rushed to actually be involved and participate in that effort. So they enlisted from Maine communities to fight in Massachusetts regiments. So we actually had quite a few people living in Maine actually participating in the direct fight for American independence.
And like you mentioned, Maine was not a state at the time. We were a department of our district of Massachusetts. That is. So, what kind of records do we have from that time period that really show our involvement?
Quite a bit, actually. One of the things that we have, and I'll show you, is a record of the people who fought or actually were encamped at Valley Forge from through the winter of 1777 to 1778. And these are actually Maine residents who had enlisted and fought in the war. They actually, in the 1930s, someone went down to Massachusetts, went through old rolls, muster rolls, and listed out every person who was listed as having enlisted from Maine. So we have anything from Solomon Hopkins to James Flood, Nathaniel Foster, people from all over the District of Maine who enlisted and actually were encamped and stationed at Valley Forge.
And going on, because obviously Valley Forge a big turning point for the war, where we really won, or really got those military bearings from Baron von Steuben and all of that good stuff. What are some other documents that we might have?
A fun one that we have that I think is really interesting is an order book that we have from Camp Morristown, which is actually in New Jersey. This starts in 1780. Jonathan Fry was stationed there. He was a clerk working with General Washington, and he actually recorded all of the orders that were coming through headquarters, the activities of headquarters. And on September 26th of 1780, he recorded the report of Benedict Arnold being discovered as a traitor and accused of treason. So he actually recorded it in this book, which shows that it happened and how the headquarters was learning about it for the first time.
Wow. Do we know how? Because obviously the Declaration of Independence didn't go over well with everyone. There were some loyalists, and obviously there were the people who wanted independence. Do we know where Maine really fell in that time period?
For Maine, it was completely. It depended on the person. Some people were really in support of independence and actively fought for that. Our indigenous communities were heavily involved on the American side in fighting for American independence and served in great numbers proudly. But there were others who were loyalists, wanted to remain under the English king, and were determined to do that. There were some battles in the American Revolution where really there would be one British person out on the battlefield, and it was Americans fighting Americans, because there were two sides to the issue. In Maine, by 1782, loyalists actually started to leave, and they would go to Canada. Because that was still a British province. But of course, the border between Maine and Canada was not very well defined. So they may have said they were in Canada, they really stayed in northern Maine. So for Maine, it was complicated. Some people were in favor of independence, some just were not.
Yeah, and 1776 obviously the war lasted through the late 80s there, but Maine became a state 1820. Were there any people involved in the Revolution that later went on to play a role in Maine politics?
Oh, there were quite a few leaders actually. Our first governor, William King, was very involved. Once Massachusetts became a state, He was a representative for Maine in Massachusetts, and then in Congress for Massachusetts, for the province of Maine, and then became our first governor. But there were lots of people who were leaders in the militias who would come back and form their own businesses, settle towns. We actually have an extensive collection of land grants that were given to Revolutionary War soldiers for their service in Massachusetts regiments. Maine had lots of land available in Massachusetts' perspective. So they were very happy to recognize someone and thank them for their service by giving them hundreds of acres of land. And we've got hundreds of documents showing that. And that's actually how many of the towns in Maine were first settled and organized, were through Revolutionary War land grants.
Wow. Very, very fascinating. Almost out of time here, but before we go, is there anything else that you really want people to know? Is there anything else that people should know about Maine's involvement in the Revolution?
We actually had a few battles here in Maine. There was the Battle of Machias, which is the largest naval battle of the American Revolution. Happened right in Machias, Maine. They do an annual event recognizing this, an annual gathering. There was lots of activity off of Castine as well. You know, the Maine coast was seen as an area that was vulnerable to British ships and British invasion. So we actually had troops, the Continental Army stationed troops along the Maine coast to protect it. So we did have a lot more involvement. We may not have been our own state or a separate colony at that time. We were part of Massachusetts, but we had a very active presence. The other thing I do like to point out is that in the Declaration of Independence, you know, July 4th, 1776, when that was written, it was printed, it was sent to all the different colonies to basically spread the word that we were separating from Britain. There were copies that were sent here to Maine. Maine, in fact, the city of Hollowell still has a copy of the Declaration of Independence that they received. But in that declaration, one of the reasons, you know, the declaration lists out the reasons of why we wanted to separate from Britain and become our own country. One of the reasons was because Britain had attacked and burned our cities. When they say that, they're actually referring to Portland, Maine. It was called Falmouth at the time. But it was Portland, Maine, and Britain had actually burned much of the city leading up to 1776. And so that was cited as a reason to separate from Britain.
Wow. A great look into our past, even pre-statehood. Kate McBrien, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.